Great. Hi. You're going to be seeing the slides behind me. If I'm in your way, I'll move over because you'll need to see them. Anyway, I'd like to thank the Gallery Association for inviting me today to participate in the Appraisal Studies program. And additionally, I'd really like to thank Yuan for all the preparations that she helped me with in coming today. I'll be talking with you today about the appraisal system in the U.S. and how appraisers abide and implement the standards and practices into their work. Today we'll review the global art market, define an appraiser and an appraisal, and review the principles, rules, standards for appraisers in the U.S. Lastly, I'd like to tell you about the Appraisers Association of America, its membership, and its programming. Well, the global art market is alive and well. In 2022, the global art market reached 67.8. Oh, are we on the third slide? Great, thank you. The global art market is alive and well. It reached $67.8 billion. With the coexistence of the physical and digital markets, sales have been robust. Customers are buying art online, in person, at art galleries, auctions, and art fairs. In 2022, the public auction sector sold $26.8 billion, making up 45% of sales. The dealer sector sold $37.2 billion worth of art, making up 55% of the sales. Of course, there's been a bit of a slowdown throughout 2023, but with the upcoming November sales, we will soon be able to determine where the global art market will land. With all this uncertainty, there is still a lot of art being sold, invested, traded, and hopefully enjoyed. In response to all this activity in the art market, it becomes ever more important for appraisers to understand their role in it and to implement the best practices in performing an appraisal and producing an appraisal report. I'm often asked to recommend a certified appraiser. There's no such thing as a certified appraiser in the fine and decorative arts in the United States. There is no central certifying body granting that designation. There is such a thing as a certified membership for appraisers, which is linked to a particular professional association for appraisers. Appraisers can hold a certified membership within a professional appraisal organization by meeting specific benchmarks set by the organization. The word certified is limited to and describes the level of membership in that organization. Okay, let's discuss what an appraiser does. An appraiser is a person who is expected to perform valuation services competently and to develop valuations that are independent, impartial, and objective based on research and professional expertise. This requires the appraiser to understand how to perform an appraisal according to the accepted practices and standards and not to have any bias towards the client or the property being appraised. The client relies on the appraiser's ability to have the requisite knowledge about the object that they are appraising and be able to perform the necessary research to produce a credible appraisal report. And we'll continue to discuss this throughout the presentation. I think it's also important to discuss what an appraiser is not. An appraiser is not an authenticator. It's not a conservator, an art dealer, an attorney, a tax advisor, or an insurance representative at the time that they are acting as an appraiser. Note there are rare situations when an appraiser happens to be the recognized authenticating expert for a particular artist or maker. In this situation, it is wise to be very careful as to avoid the potential for conflict of interest. We all know that authenticity is a criterion for value. To reiterate, an appraiser performs valuation services that are independent, impartial, and objective. Also, an appraiser is not an advocate for the client and cannot arrive at a predetermined value in favor of the client's interest. This relates to the purpose of the appraisal. If an appraisal is for tax purposes, the client may want a low value. Conversely, if the appraisal is for a donation, they would want a higher value. An independent appraiser will come to their valuation without any of these considerations. Okay, so what's an appraisal? An appraisal is a professional's opinion of value of a client's property. It can be in written form or oral form. It's a legal document that qualifies the value of the property. The appraisal requires knowledge, experience, and professional judgment. It requires the analysis of relevant information to the specified property and research in the appropriate marketplace. The appraisal is a formal and organized document that allows the client to follow the appraiser in the valuation process in a logical manner. It should clearly state the methodology used by the appraiser to arrive at the valuation conclusion. It is a document that is clearly written so that the layperson, the non-professional, can understand how the appraiser reached their conclusion. The appraisal report includes any limitations that the appraiser has when developing their opinion of value. For example, were they unable to remove the picture from the wall? Was the sculpture too heavy and they couldn't look at the bottom? All of these conditions and assumptions need to be documented in the appraisal report so that anyone reading the appraisal will understand how the appraiser settled on their value. Okay, so what do people get appraised? Well, we all know there's paintings and sculptures and works on paper, digital media, furniture, ceramic, glass, antiques, silver, household and office contents, books and manuscripts, rugs, wine, coins, collectibles, memorabilia, gems and jewelry, musical instruments, and boats and cars. This list of objects is often referred to as personal property. Throughout my talk, you'll likely hear me use the phrase personal property. Let's consider who would need an appraisal. We all know that private collectors use appraisers, lawyers who work with estates or act as executors or trustees, museums, cultural institutions, historical societies, insurance companies, adjusters, corporations, artists, artist estates, foundations, banks, and business managers. All of these people and entities need appraisals for a wide range of purposes. To accurately insure one's property in case of a damage and loss, so an insurance appraisal. For charitable donations, they would need to know the value of the work that's being donated. Estate tax, estate planning, what happens if someone passes and they need to distribute the property or for tax purposes. Situation of divorce, equitable distribution. Or when art is being used as collateral for a loan. Inventory purposes, liquidation. I've just described who an appraiser is and the uses of an appraisal. I'd now like to discuss the principles that guide appraisers in the U.S. A confluence of economic events occurred in the late 1980s, which were actually quite serious. A significant financial crisis resulted from bad mortgages based on appraisals made by real estate appraisers. These events caused the failure of nearly a third of the saving and loan banks in the United States, a huge financial loss to the public. These events led to the creation of the Appraisal Foundation in 1987 by Congress. The Appraisal Foundation was charged with developing and promoting minimum standards of practice and the qualification criteria for all appraisers. This would include real estate, personal property, those that appraise the fine and decorative arts, and business appraisers. This resulted in the Appraisal Foundation developing what I think many of you know of is the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice, known in the profession as USPAP. USPAP is the recognized standards for the appraisal profession in the United States. For real estate appraisers, they are required to follow USPAP and also to gain a license to perform appraisals. For appraisers who specialize in the fine and decorative arts, there are no such laws mandating that they follow these principles. However, the Internal Revenue Service, our tax agency, requires all appraisals that are submitted to them for donations, charitable donations, and estate tax to be in accordance with the practices and standards of USPAP. Those appraisers that hold themselves to the highest standards, including all members of the Appraisers Association, follow these principles and produce USPAP-compliant appraisals for all purposes. The standards of USPAP place greater responsibility on the appraiser to act in a manner that promotes public trust and confidence in their appraisal services. USPAP creates a set of standards and emphasizes specialized knowledge, experience, objectivity, independence, and integrity. With the implementation of these standards, they prevent intentional or unintentional misrepresentation, misstating, or concealing of significant facts or conclusion in an appraisal. USPAP includes a set of principles, rules, standards for appraisers to follow. And they include a set of definitions, the ethics rule, the record-keeping rule, the competency rule, the scope of work, the jurisdictional exception rule. In addition, there's a set of standards. Standards 7 and 8 specifically refer to people that appraise the fine and decorative arts. For this talk, I'll review with you the ethics rule, the record-keeping and competency rule, and the jurisdictional exception rule. Let's begin with the ethics rule. It's made up of 3 components: conduct, management, and confidentiality. The first component of the ethics rule is conduct. This states that the appraiser must perform assignments with impartiality, objectivity, and independence. They further state that an appraiser must not perform an assignment with bias. They must not advocate the cause or interest of any party or issue. They must not agree to perform an assignment that includes a predetermined value, opinion, or conclusion. So that's really key. You can't predetermine. You can't have something in advance. And they must not use or rely on any unsupported conclusions to maximize the value. The management section specifically refers to how the appraiser is compensated. How are they paid? This section has many components, so I'll review only the most pertinent aspects of it. Under the management rule, an appraiser is required to be compensated by charging a flat fee or an hourly wage. They never should have their fee based on a percentage of the value of the work. This is a very important aspect of USPAP, as it eliminates any inclination to inflate the value in order for the appraiser to receive a higher fee. In addition, the appraiser must disclose if there's any fee or commission in connection with getting the assignment. It's not unethical, it just needs to be disclosed in the appraisal report. For example, if my colleague sent me a client, they may ask to be compensated for getting me the work. All I need is to disclose it in the appraisal report. In addition, the management rule requires that an appraiser must not agree to perform an assignment or have a compensation arrangement for an assignment that is contingent on any of the following: The appraiser must not agree to report a predetermined value, such as reporting a favorable value to secure a loan or to reduce a client's tax bill. Lastly, an appraiser must disclose any interest that they have had in the property in the last 3 years. So for example, when they were wearing their dealer hat, they sold the property. They need to disclose that in the report. The last component of the ethics rule is confidentiality. Under the confidentiality rule, an appraiser must protect the confidential nature of the appraiser-client relationship. The appraiser must not disclose confidential information or the assignment results to anyone but their client or those that their client has given their consent. These three components of the ethics rule, conduct, management, and confidentiality, formulate the steps an appraiser must follow to promote and preserve public trust. Let's move on now to the record-keeping rule. The record-keeping rule stipulates that an appraiser must prepare a file for each work of their work for each appraisal assignment, and it must exist prior to giving the appraisal to the client. This work file must include the client's name and all supporting material that they used and that will substantiate the ultimate value that they come up with. Finally, a copy of the report must be kept in the file. If an appraiser has given an oral report, they verbally gave a value, they too would need to keep a written report. The competency rule is interesting, and it states that an appraiser, 1, may be competent to perform an assignment, 2, may acquire the necessary competency to do the assignment, or 3, decline or withdraw the assignment. So let's define what is competency. An example would be if you are a specialist in post-war art and you were given a painting by Li Yufan to appraise. You would have the expertise to appraise that work. Hence, you would be competent. However, if you were given a painting by, say, Anna Park, who is considered an ultra-contemporary artist, you may not have the expertise or be competent to appraise that work. However, USPAP allows you to gain the competency, gain the experience that you would need to perform that assignment. Under USPAP, you would have the ability to take on the assignment. Now, of course, if you don't have the expertise and are unable to gain that expertise, then you would have to decline or withdraw from that assignment. Some of this is sort of common sense, I would think. The jurisdictional exception rule refers to a state or local rule or regulation that prevents the appraiser from being able to comply with a part of USPAP. In this case, you would only not follow USPAP for the area that the law covers, but comply with all other aspects of USPAP. The jurisdictional exceptions are really very uncommon when appraising the fine and decorative arts. Well, we've just reviewed the key components of USPAP, excluding the standards which discuss the development and communication of an appraisal. USPAP is taught over 15 hours, and there's also an exam. However, I hope that the brief overview of USPAP will provide you with an understanding of how appraisers in the U.S. implement ethical practices to ensure that their appraisals provide the public with impartial, objective, and independent appraisals. Appraisers who follow USPAP produce USPAP-compliant reports. Okay, let's move on to discuss how appraisals are developed. In order to produce a compliant USPAP report, an appraiser must understand the basics. Let's start with defining value. This is always confusing to folks. They confuse value with cost or price. Cost is the actual or estimated amount required to create, reproduce, or replace an object. Price is the amount asked or paid for an object. It's the sale price. Value is neither cost nor price. Value is the monetary relationship between the properties and those who buy, sell, or use those properties. Value also expresses an economic concept. Art-related considerations would include the artist's history, the oeuvre of the artist's work, and of course many other considerations. And we'll discuss a few of those as we go along with this presentation. It's important to remember that a value is an opinion. Value is an opinion of the worth of the property at a specific time in accordance with specific conditions and definitions. And we'll go through those definitions in a little bit. So just to repeat, value is an opinion of the worth of a property at a specific time in accordance with a specific definition of value. It's important to understand that when an appraiser develops an opinion of value, that it's not a fact. A sale price is a fact. It's been consummated. An opinion of value is just that. It's an opinion. Values can be expressed in a single value or in a range. So how does an appraiser develop an opinion of value? Well, there are different types of value as well as different approaches to value. We all need to be understood and considered when producing a USPAP compliant appraisal. There are several different types of values, and they are all used for different purposes. One needs to understand the differences in these values and when to employ them in an appraisal. So let's start with a retail replacement value. This is the highest amount required to replace an object with another of similar quality, origin, age, appearance, provenance, and condition within a reasonable length of time in the most appropriate market. This value is most often used when an appraiser is developing an appraisal report for insurance purposes. A retail replacement value will include sales tax, import tax, commissions, auction premiums, framing, shipping, and all other fees. A fair market value includes a buyer's premium and may include applicable taxes and other commissions. A fair market value is used when preparing an appraisal to be submitted to the U.S. tax agency for purposes of charitable gift donations or estate tax. A fair market value appraisal may also be used for collateral purposes and sometimes equitable distribution of assets. A marketable cash value is the net value realized from an orderly sale of the property. It excludes all costs such as commissions, advertising, traveling, and shipping. So it doesn't include any of those. It's used when appraising art to assist with the equitable distribution of assets, sale advice, or just estate planning. Liquidation value is generally lower than all other types of value. This value is reached when art is sold under forced conditions or under time restraints. Examples of these types of sales would be an estate sale or through a pawn shop. Examples of these types of sales would be, this value is often used in bankruptcy situations when creditors or inheritors are anxious to receive cash, a cash settlement. And then we have sentimental value. Now, I hope I got this right. That's when a value, sentimental value is when the value of something has a personal or an emotional association rather than the material worth. So unfortunately, the value is usually zero. Now that I've described the different types of value, I'd like to just discuss the different approaches to value. When developing an appraisal report, it requires that all three value approaches be considered. Let's start with the income approach. The income approach is used to determine the value of an object which will generate future income through leasing, rental, or reproduction. Most often this approach is applied when leasing or renting an object or when creating reproductions. The number of artworks which generate income is actually quite small, and hence the income approach is rarely used. If it is used, often an appraiser will collaborate with an accountant, an economist, a business appraiser to determine the value. It's actually quite a complicated process. The cost approach, there's another approach. The cost approach is used when the value of an object is based on the cost of manufacturing or duplicating, recreating the identical object. The cost approach reaches a valuation conclusion based on the amount of money needed to make an exact copy of the object. Most works of art are unique and cannot be remade. So the cost approach here is also only occasionally gets used. It might make sense to use the cost approach in instances where the artist continues to make identical items, such as studio furniture. One might also consider this valuation approach in the case of a commissioned artwork, if the artist is still alive and willing to recreate the work. The sales comparison approach, in contrast, relies on comparable sales and available price data, as well as input of the specialist's knowledge to reach a valuation conclusion. In using comparable sale approach, the appraiser identifies documented sales of work similar to the work that they are appraising and as close to the work, and as close to the work being appraised in national origin, age, form, style, medium, quality, and condition. Comparables are most often found at auction, but primary sales through galleries and dealers can also be used. When choosing comparables based on auction sales, the appraiser must include all the relevant information in the appraisal report. So if they're using a sale that happened at Christie's 6 months ago, they need to have the date of the sale, the name of the auction house, the location of that auction house, the sale number, if it's a single owner sale, the name of that sale, the lot number, the description of the item, medium, size, was it signed, the condition, and the hammer price. Comparables based on private sales also must include the date and the location of the dealer, the show, the price at which the piece was offered, and then what it was sold for. The type of buyer, was it a museum or a private collector? The appraiser is using comparative market data to develop their opinion of value. So the information you are seeking is to justify your value. Using comparables as a valuation basis is the most common approach to valuing the fine and decorative arts. The appraiser has determined the type of value and the approach to value after considering all the options. However, before choosing their comparables, they will need to know the facts about the picture or object they are appraising. Information that they need to compile includes, and I have to read the slide, the name and the country of origin, the dates of the artist, the subject matter, medium, technique, dimensions, condition, provenance, exhibition history, etc. They also need to know the historic significance of the work. Where does it fall in all of the body of the work of the artist? Is the work desirable? Do people actually want this particular work? Is it a rare piece of work? What's the quality like? Is there liquidity in the artist market? All these different aspects of it need to be considered. In the initial step in the appraisal process, the appraiser identifies the purpose of the appraisal. This sets the parameters of the assignment and eliminates any ambiguity about the client expectations or the assignment. So the appraiser is going to start by identifying the client and who's going to use the appraisal. The intended use of the appraisal. Is it for estate planning? Is it for a charitable donation? Is it for insurance? The type of value. So now I have to figure out which value to use, which approach to value, and then the effective date. And what that means, the appraisal is as of a specific date. So if there was an insurance loss, if a year ago there was a catastrophe at one's home, the the value has to be as of that date of the loss. So they have to determine what is the date, because they're not going to base their opinion of value on works that sold today when it's a year ago that they need to find out what it was worth. The appraisal report includes all the elements just described and needs to be a formal and organized document that allows the reader to follow the appraiser in the valuation process in a very logical manner. This would require that any terms or definitions be defined in the report. So you may be doing an appraisal for someone and they never heard the term of provenance before. That definition would need to be in the report. The report should be written with simplicity and clarity. Avoid unnecessary tangents or flowery descriptions. The appraiser must have the ability to clearly and logically articulate their methodology as to how they arrived at the valuation conclusion. The writing in the report should be concise and precise. Lots of text is not always better if it doesn't support the value. There are many components that make up an appraisal, and they are all important to ensure that the client is getting a value that they can trust. So that's the overall aspect of how we focus, the very beginning pieces of how we put together an appraisal. What's required, the standards, the practices, and what goes into developing that report. I'd like to now sort of talk to you about the Appraisers Association of America. So the association was established in 1949, and it's the premier association of personal property appraisers who focus specifically on the fine and decorative arts. We have a membership of over 800 independent appraisers in 108 different areas of specialization. Our members hold the widest range of experience and expertise in their respective disciplines. We're based in New York City, the epicenter of the international art market. However, our members are located throughout 43 states across the U.S. and from countries across the globe that include Austria, Canada, China, Egypt, England, France, Italy, Puerto Rico, Korea, and Taiwan. Members of the association become accredited or certified in areas of specialization, such as Old Masters, Impressionist and Modern, Contemporary, Emerging, or they could be specialists in sports memorabilia, entertainment memorabilia, and other areas include stamps, wine, couture clothing, posters, anime, 19th century silver, mid-century furniture. The list really does go on. To become a member, a person is required to complete an application, provide references, and document their education and experience. Once they've been accepted as a candidate for membership, they go on to take 120 hours of education courses. And could we go to the next slide, please? Okay. Well, the courses include, thank you, the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice, Theory and Methodology, Research, Legal and Ethical, and Appraisal Writing. Once the courses are complete, they then need to submit 3 appraisal reports: an estate, an insurance, and a donation report. And these 3 reports are peer-reviewed to test their expertise in valuing as also in their specialization. That's to become an accredited member. To become a certified member, which is our highest level, they then have to take a 7-hour closed book exam. And there too, they're testing their knowledge, more on the connoisseurship aspects of it. Once a candidate becomes a member, they are required to abide by USPAP and produce USPAP-compliant appraisal reports. Additionally, they're required to complete 70 hours of continuing education credits every 5 years. In 1983, the Board of Directors of the Appraisers Association created the Appraisal Institute of America. In 2013, the Institute published a handbook on appraising art titled All About Appraising, The Definitive Guide to Appraising the Fine and Decorative Arts. And I'm really excited to say that in 2024, we're actually going to be publishing our second volume, and that will include 50 new articles. In addition, the Institute created the Comprehensive Appraisal Studies program in 2016. This program provides the necessary coursework for those who have little or no experience in the field of appraising. To date, we've had 319 graduates from CASP. In addition, the Institute presents programs and conferences throughout the year, including a 2-day national conference that covers connoisseurship and theory and methodology. We also present an annual conference that focuses on art law. This year alone, we've offered 80 programs that were attended by 2,600 people in person and virtually. And so I want to thank you for this opportunity, and I'd be really happy to answer any questions.
네, 지금까지 린다 셀빈 AAA 상임이사님께서 강연을 모두 마쳐주셨고요. 혹시 질문 있으신 분은 자유롭게 질문 받도록 하겠습니다.
I do have 2 questions that were submitted to me prior, so maybe I can start with those. So the questions that were submitted to me earlier, I'll just go through them. And the first one was, how do appraisers themselves determine whether or not the conclusions they draw from their appraisal evaluations are reasonable? And I thought that was an excellent question, because they're using, in most cases, they're going to use comparable data. And so they're basing it off of actual facts, consummated sales. And so taking into consideration all the different aspects that we went through, what is the origin of the work, what's the condition, which period is the piece that you're appraising from. You want to make sure, of course, that if you're appraising a Jasper Johns, you're appraising a piece that's similar to the piece that you have to appraise. You wouldn't do an early Jasper Johns. You wouldn't use an early Jasper Johns as a comparable if you're appraising a late Johns work on paper, and an earlier work was like mixed media. So you want to try to use, material and work of the artist that's similar to the piece that you're appraising. And so you're basing it off of known actual sales of similar work. But one of the things to really keep in mind is that it's your opinion of value. And there's another question that sort of talks a little bit about this. It's your opinion. You have gotten all this information together, you've pulled the sales that you think are relevant to this piece that you're appraising, and you're coming up with what you consider an objective, impartial opinion of value. I may be doing the same piece and appraising the same piece and come up with maybe a slightly different value. And that's okay, because that's my opinion. And it might be because I think the condition of the piece that I'm appraising isn't great. And so my valuation may be off just slightly. However, if someone else did an evaluation and it was significantly off, that would be a red flag for me. But it's oftentimes that they're not exactly the same. Everybody thinks differently. We pull the information together differently, but you don't want those huge differences. If there's a huge difference, then you know that something is not right. Okay, number 2, having a well-organized system like USPAP alone does not guarantee a healthy appraisal ecosystem. Then what are some elements that must be considered together? Also, what professional training measures are available? So, 2-part question. USPAP can guide appraisers. Again, to mention that the IRS system in the states requires that most of their appraisals be USPAP compliant. But it's really the associations. There's 3 associations in the United States. One is called the American Society of Appraisers, and they have real estate, business appraisers, as well as personal property appraisers as part of their membership. And there's another organization called the International Society of Appraisers, and they have appraisers that are more generalists. So they would have a fine art category as a specialist. but they don't break it down to imp mod or contemporary or emerging or old masters. It's a very general heading. All three organizations require their members to be USPAP compliant, to have continuing education requirements. We all have a code of ethics that they must follow. And the industry that all the various industries that use appraisers in the States really rely on the associations to monitor the appraisers. I always tell the public, when I get calls all the time, do you know about this appraiser? I found him on the web. And I would say, this person is not a member of my organization, but you can check with the other two associations. And I would highly recommend that you only use an appraiser that's part of an association. And that's sort of how we keep check on what's happening. Most of the industry, again, the insurers, the banks, conservators, collectors know that at a minimum, an appraiser must complete a USPAP compliant report. But it's highly, highly sought after to find an appraiser that belongs to one of the three organizations, just to ensure that there's some checks and balances. Okay. Third, from your non-Korean perspective, what is the biggest difference between the art appraisal in Korea and in the United States? For example, culture or matters that require attention. I can't really speak to the appraisal process in Korea because I don't know it that well. We've had a lot of people come to the States from Korea to get training, and so I know what their level of knowledge is, but I don't know what the requirements are here in Korea. So I'm sorry I can't answer that question. So those were the three questions that I had, and if anyone else has questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
추가 질문 있으신 분은 자유롭게 말씀 부탁드릴게요.
So you need a mic.
여기 최소한 120시간의 교육 이수가 좀 필요하다고 기재되어 있는데 이게 미국에 있는 협회 본사 건물에서 진행하는 교육을 이제 이수를 말씀하시는 건지, 그리고 또 혹시나 이게 온라인으로도 이수가 가능하게끔 열려 있는지 궁금합니다. 네. 하고 또 세 개의 리포트 작성하는데, 세 개의 리포트를 작성하는 데 있어서 이게 뭔가 시간 제한이 있는 그러한 시험 유형인지도 궁금합니다.
So I'll start with the first part, and the courses are offered online, so one does not need to be there in person. As for the three reports, there's a candidacy period, and that is 2 years. And so people have 2 years to create those reports, and it could actually be an appraisal that they've done in the past, and they just redact any personal information. But they do have 2 years, and then they can renew their candidacy for one more 2-year period. So we do give them time to be able to create them. Life is busy. And the 120 hours was really set forth by the Appraisal Foundation in DC. That said all appraisers must have a minimum of 120 credits. No questions? Oh, yes.
그 감정평가사가 감정평가서를 다 작성을 완료하고 클라이언트에 제출을 하고 완전 프로젝트를 이제 끝낸 이후에 감정평가사가 그 감정평가서에 대한 오류를 발견했다거나 추가적인 내용을 코멘트하고 싶을 때 어떠한 절차가 규정된 게 있는지 궁금합니다.
It seldom happens, quite honestly. But if, for example, if they found an art, piece of art, a sale that happened that would really, really change that value, then they can update the report. They would have to, they would basically, when they update the report, it's issuing a new report. So it does happen if something very unusual, but also an outlier sale, you really wouldn't take that into consideration because it is such an outlier. For example, if something came to auction and it was really like almost the exact work that you're actually appraising, but that auction, that particular auction was to raise money for a charity. And so people were very generous with their bidding. It's unlikely that you would use that as a comparable because of those unusual circumstances around that, that auction. Okay. Well,
예, 저는 약간 원초적인 질문이긴 한데 미국에서는 이 감정을 하면 시간당 페이나 또 만약 건으로 한다고 하면 건당 페이가 어떻게 되는지 좀 알고 싶습니다.
So an appraiser, and this is part of USPAP, is paid an hourly rate or a flat fee. And again, they're never paid on the percentage of the value of the work that they're appraising. Because of course, if they did a percentage, then there would be an inclination to give a higher value. So for ethical purposes, it's always a flat fee or an hourly rate.
I'm interested in the credentials of the appraisers in the U.S. Are many of them the gallery owners, or are there any like full-time appraisers who is not interested in the private sales market?
That's a great question. Actually, it's across the board. So so everybody wears different hats. And again, as I mentioned, you're never going to wear two hats at once, because that's where the conflict comes in. But there are many of our members that only do appraising. That's all they're interested in. They're not interested in selling or advising or any of that. However, there are many members who also do that, advise and deal, or some of them are conservators, some of them are insurance adjusters. It's really across the board, but there are many that just do appraising. Appraising is a field where you're constantly learning and you're constantly researching. And so some people just, that's their personality. They just want to constantly learn, they just want to constantly do the research, and to them that's very fulfilling. And so they don't want, because dealing or being a gallery dealer, it's a very different set of skills. So yes.
So this is more of a personal and general question. I was wondering how like the restitution and repatriation issue is affecting the U.S. appraisal market, because like a lot of things are happening, and as you mentioned, there's going to be updates about like 50 art laws involving in like restitution and other like AMLD. So I was wondering your opinions about that and your general view on the market.
That's a great question. We're actually going to be addressing that at this year's Art Law Conference. It would really depend when the appraiser is researching the market. So a piece, for example, a piece came up for sale that has to be appraised, and there were similar pieces that were sold at auction. However, yesterday it came up and it was recognized that this piece was stolen from a colonized country. That would really change all the data that was that came before it. So it's likely they could not, first of all, they can't put a value on it because it's stolen work. So there's nothing that's valid about this piece of work. So in that case, a normal appraisal would not be done. And it's very likely that they couldn't do an appraisal.
Well, thank you for the answer. This is a follow-up question. So, in that case, the court has to be involved with the all these disputes, and I think there's a lot of issue going on between like whether the court is eligible to actually decide the authenticity or the valuation of the
I'm sorry, I'm
works.
not getting the whole question. Let me just go ahead, repeat that.
Yes. So in that case, I think the court has to be involved in the disputes, and I was wondering, like, when the court are involved, if the court's decision, the final decision, actually matters in the market, because I think there's a lot of disputes whether the courts should be eligible to determine the authenticity or the valuation of the works. So how is your view on that as well?
I don't think the courts would determine a valuation. The courts always rely on appraisers to do the valuations. So that is not something that they would be involved with at all. And you know, they have to call on the experts. I think that it's a really complicated process at this point, because so many pieces are now being identified as having been stolen. And I think the definition of stolen is still sort of, you know, it's being worked out in the courts. It's a complicated question. And I think, again, I think it's, you know, this is happening in real time. And so I think we're going to see a lot more shuffling of work in museums and also in private collections.
한국의 경우에는 시가감정사나 한 결과들을 이제 한국화랑협회와 같은 그런 협회에서 발행하는 그런 보증서나 평가서를 이제 사람들이 더 믿고 신뢰를 하는데, 이제 미국 같은 경우에는 이제 개인의 시가감정 평가사가 내는 그런 레포트를 더 이제 신임하고, 그러니까 미국은 그 평가사의 개인의 이름을 더 믿고, 이제 한국은 문화가 협회의 이름을 더 믿고, 그러한 문화 차이가 있는데, 그렇게 개인으로서 내가 인정을 받고 또 사람들이 이렇게 찾아와서 일을 맡길 수 있는 것에는 이제 경험과 내가 내는 평가 보고서의 결과가 많이 누적이 될수록 이게 시간이 해결해서 그러한 건지 궁금합니다. 네.
So thank you for that question. It's a good one. So the reason the independent appraiser is trusted because there's no opportunity for a conflict of interest. So if you're a dealer, it's likely that you sold the work that your client is coming back and asking you for an appraisal. And it's just too close to have an objective, to be able to be objective. To make sure that you're objective, people go to an independent appraiser. There's a gallery association in the States that also had at one point an appraisal department, but they were separately incorporated to separate. So it wasn't the gallery that was doing the appraisal, it was actually an organization within the gallery association. But again, it was separate, so it wasn't part of that same business entity. And what was happening is that the galleries that belonged to that association would send their clients to that component of the association. But again, it was incorporated separately so that it could be, there could be no chance of conflict of interest. Many of so in the States, all like Christie's, Sotheby's, Phillips, Bottoms, Heritage, all the auction houses, all their staff, whether it's a specialist, we train everybody in USPAT. So everybody knows that it has the minimum standards, and so they follow USPAT. It's a little difficult, though, when you are at Christie's and you're asked to do an appraisal for an object that you would likely ultimately want to sell. So depending on the purpose of that appraisal, if you ultimately just want to know the value because you want to take it to sale, the auction house is a perfect place to go. right? And they're usually free. As we spoke about earlier, an appraisal, there's a fee involved, and it can be quite high because the appraiser could put in hours of research to find the right comparables. Let's talk about what goes into an appraisal. We're doing a market analysis. So what's the market for that artist? What's the market like for that particular oeuvre of the artist? So that's going to be a separate analysis. If it's a post-war contemporary piece of work, what's the state of the market for post-war contemporary art? And then there has to be an analysis of the work that they're appraising to the various comparables. And there's usually at least 3 comparables, right? So they have to, why are you using, they have to justify why are they using those 3 comparables to come up with their value. And that's going to substantiate it. And again, it has to be written in a way so that someone who is not an appraiser, someone who doesn't know, is not really that familiar with the art world or the art market, would be able to read that appraisal and understand it and understand how the appraiser got to their value. But I think the conflict of interest issue is huge. And I think that that's why, certainly now at this point in the States, they look for independent appraisers. Because, you know, the art carries such a large value, right? It's just increased dramatically over the last 10, 20 years. So there's a lot invested there. And so it really needs to be sure that there's a objective valuation being made, because, you know, using it as collateral, using it for a loan, and it's, you know, art is now used for investment purposes. There's a lot that's, it needs to be accurate and not biased valuation.
더 이상 질문 없으시면 오늘 강연은 여기서 마무리하도록 하겠습니다. 오늘 강연 진행해 주신 미국 감정가협회 상임이사님이신 린다 셀빈께 큰 박수 부탁드립니다.